My name is Julia. I'm 32, and this past Christmas morning, I was handed a small gift bag that shattered every illusion I still held about my family and about the man I once planned to marry. There was no wrapping paper, no fancy bow, just a plain red bag with tissue paper poking out awkwardly, like whoever packed it had done it in a rush or with shaky hands. It was from my brother, Darren. I hadn't spoken more than a few words to him in over a year. Not since the wedding that never happened, not since he took sides in a war I never meant to start. But that morning, as my mom passed around mugs of cider and Christmas carols played softly in the background, he walked over to me. Quiet, solemn, no smile, no greeting. Just that bag. "Thought you should have this back," he said. I remember blinking, my fingers tightening around the mug in my hand. There was something about his voice, low, uncertain, that made my stomach twist before I even peeked inside. And then I saw it. Nestled in the folds of crumpled tissue paper was my engagement ring, platinum, oval cut, a ring I hadn't seen since the week my life fell apart. I didn't reach for it. My hands refused to move. I just stared, like maybe if I didn't touch it, none of it would be real. Then I saw the note, folded once, tucked beside the ring like a final nail. It was short. No greeting. No closure. Just 7 words, written in the unmistakable handwriting of my ex-fiancé, Brandon. "You don't deserve her. He does." If you've ever had your trust shattered by someone you love, or watched your world crack open during what was supposed to be a joyful moment, you're not alone. I'm sharing my full story here, one chapter at a time. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your voice matters more than you know. My breath caught in my throat. My ears began to ring. I felt cold, like the heat had drained from the room, from my skin, from the blood in my body. My mom kept humming along to Bing Crosby. My dad asked if someone could pass the butter, but I was frozen. The world kept moving around me while I just cracked open. "You don't deserve her. He does." I hadn't seen Brandon in nearly 16 months, not since he walked out 2 weeks before our wedding. No explanation, no conversation, just silence. His things disappeared one day while I was at work, and the next time I heard his name, it was on my brother's tongue, full of apologies and broken sentences, and "I'm sorry, Jules." I didn't know what to say. But now I understood. The silence, the distance, the awkwardness that had haunted every family gathering since. They had both known. Maybe not from the start, but at some point. They had made a choice. And it hadn't been me. I was never supposed to find out like this. I clenched my jaw and slipped the note back inside the bag, folding the tissue over the ring like I was trying to bury it again. My hands were shaking, and suddenly, the weight of the entire room felt unbearable. The fake cheer, the casual cruelty. That moment, sitting on my parents' couch, holding the last symbol of a life I was supposed to live, was the moment I finally accepted something I had refused to believe for over a year. The people closest to me had never truly chosen me. I had been easy to replace, and now, on Christmas morning, they had wrapped that truth in red tissue paper and handed it back to me like a present. It's strange how the mind edits the past, how it protects you from noticing things too early until it's too late to forget them. I met Brandon when I was 26, and he was 30. I had just moved into a new apartment after a brutal breakup that left me doubting my own worth. Brandon lived in the unit above mine, and for weeks I heard his heavy boots on the stairs, the clink of his keys, the sound of him humming while making coffee at 5:45 every morning. When we finally crossed paths at the mailbox, it was the way he smiled that got me. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't forced. It was tired. Like he was carrying his own grief and didn't mind if mine sat beside it for a while. That was the man I fell in love with. Kind, quiet, steady. The kind of man who'd wait outside my job during a rainstorm just to walk me home. The kind who fixed my cabinet door before I even noticed it was broken. The kind who, on my 28th birthday, drove 6 hours to find the exact bakery that made the cherry pie my grandma used to bring every Thanksgiving. He never raised his voice, never made me feel small. And after the things I'd lived through in past relationships, That alone felt like a miracle. So when he proposed 2 years in, I said yes, without hesitation. Not because I was desperate to be married, but because I believed, truly believed, that I had finally found someone safe. I didn't know yet that silence can be just as sharp as cruelty. That absence has a weight of its own. The first crack came from my brother. Darren had always been complicated. We weren't close growing up. He was loud, magnetic, always the center of the room. I was the quieter one, the one who followed rules and never needed rescuing. He resented that, I think, how easily I seemed to disappear while he had to fight to be noticed. But we never hated each other. Not really. We had moments of closeness. He came to my graduation, even cried at it. And when Brandon entered my life, I actually thought Darren liked him. They played basketball together, talked about stocks and sports and cars, things I couldn't care less about. It felt good to see them bond. But about 6 months before the wedding, something shifted. Darren stopped responding to my texts, missed dinner with our parents twice in a row. When I brought it up to Brandon, he just shrugged. "He's probably busy," he said. "You know how he is." But I didn't know how he was, not like Brandon suddenly seemed to. When I tried to press, Brandon would change the subject, make jokes, touch my hand, and redirect me with sweetness. And I let it happen. Because that's what love does sometimes. It hushes your instincts. It tells you to give the benefit of the doubt. Looking back, I remember one moment that should have stopped me cold. We were reviewing the guest list for the wedding. I had already sent out invitations, but Darren hadn't RSVP'd. I asked Brandon if he'd heard from him. He hesitated, then said, "I don't think he's coming." I stared at him. "What do you mean? Why wouldn't he?" Brandon looked down at his phone, like he was suddenly very busy. "He doesn't think we're right for each other." That stung, but it didn't register the way it should have. I was too hurt, too confused to realize what he didn't say, that maybe he agreed with Darren, that maybe the conversations they were having, behind my back, weren't about my wedding at all. The second red flag came in the form of secrets. One night, I found a receipt in Brandon's coat pocket. A dinner for two at a place we used to love, the kind with candlelight and wine and a dessert tray that always made me laugh. But we hadn't gone there in over a year. When I asked him about it, he told me he had taken a client, some boring dinner with a guy from out of town. I believed him, even though the server's name on the receipt was circled in pen, and I would later recognize it as the same woman who used to serve Darren when we were kids. The kind of waitress who remembers your birthday and your usual order. Why would a random client dinner require that kind of effort? But I pushed it aside, like I had learned to do. Because loving someone, truly loving them, often means looking away from the shadows they cast. At least until the shadows swallow you whole. And that's exactly what happened the morning he left. There was no fight, no incident, just absence. He left a note on the counter that said, "I'm sorry. This isn't right anymore." That was it. And when Darren showed up at my apartment a week later, eyes filled with some unspoken panic, I thought he had come to comfort me. But he couldn't meet my gaze. He gave me flowers. Said Brandon had been confused, that men panic before weddings all the time, that maybe it was better this way. And again, I listened, because if I let myself consider the other possibility, that this wasn't about panic or confusion, but something calculated, I would have broken in too. I wish I had broken then. Instead, I held it together. I cleaned the apartment. I returned the dress. I smiled through the aftershocks and told everyone I was fine. I told myself I was fine. Until Christmas morning, when I opened that gift bag and the truth finally stopped hiding. In the days after Christmas, silence followed me like a shadow. It wasn't the peaceful kind, not the hush of snowfall or a quiet morning in bed. It was a heavy, haunted silence. The kind that filled the air between people who once knew each other deeply, but now only shared memories soaked in betrayal. I didn't answer texts. I didn't check my email. I didn't respond when my mom sent a casual, "How are you feeling today?" as if I'd come down with the flu and not opened a box that detonated my entire past. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I'm great, just reliving every moment I defended my brother and fiancé while they slowly erased me. I couldn't sleep that first night. I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment over and over. The gift bag, the ring, the note, Brandon's handwriting, Darren's eyes when he handed it to me. Not cruel, not even smug, just detached. That bothered me more than anything, because if he had handed me that ring with a smirk, at least I could have hated him outright. But he didn't. He looked like someone offering closure, like a nurse bringing in the death certificate after the funeral. He knew. He knew it would hurt. And he still gave it to me anyway. No warning, no apology. Just, thought you should have this back. I don't know what was worse, the betrayal itself, or the fact that he didn't think I deserved better than a silent delivery of my own grief. I kept the bag on my dresser. I told myself I'd throw it out, but I didn't. Every time I tried, my hands shook, like it had some kind of weight I couldn't lift yet. The days blurred. I started noticing things that made me question everything. I remembered a brunch we had a year ago, the four of us, me, Brandon, Darren, and my best friend Elise. Darren had made a joke about practice vows and elbowed Brandon, who went red and spilled his mimosa. I thought he was just being awkward, but now I wonder what he was hiding behind that blush. Then there was the weekend Brandon canceled our engagement photo session last minute. Said he was helping Darren move a couch. That had been 2 months before he left. I texted Darren that night. He never replied. There were so many little gaps like that. Moments I brushed off, because I trusted both of them more than I trusted my own discomfort. They were the two men I believed would never lie to me. Now, I realized I had been surrounded by silence long before Brandon disappeared. The silence between us wasn't sudden, it was growing, creeping in through the cracks I refused to seal. Even in the months after Brandon left, Darren never asked me how I was doing, not once, not a single check-in. He ghosted me as completely as Brandon had, but I never questioned it. I figured he was embarrassed, or uncomfortable. I thought I made him uncomfortable by being the sister with the broken heart. But now I saw it differently. He wasn't uncomfortable. He was guilty. Or worse, he wasn't guilty at all. He was indifferent. I didn't know which was worse. By New Year's Eve, I had stopped eating properly. My body moved like it didn't belong to me. I watched fireworks from my apartment window, wrapped in a blanket, clutching the note I swore I wouldn't read again. You don't deserve her. He does. 7 words. That was all Brandon thought I was worth. After 5 years of love, laughter, shared books, burned dinners, hospital visits, birthdays, holidays. 5 years of building a life I thought we both wanted. I remember when we toured the wedding venue, a barn-turned ballroom in the hills outside Asheville. Brandon had spun me in the empty space and said, "This is where we'll dance into forever." Now I know. It was already a performance. I didn't leave the house until January 3rd. That morning, I walked into the coffee shop on Main just to feel normal again. The barista recognized me. "Where have you been?" she asked, smiling. I smiled back and said, "Just needed a break." It was the closest thing to truth I could manage. I sat by the window with my tea, watching people rush past in coats and boots, making plans, holding hands. And for the first time, I didn't envy them. I didn't want their happiness. I just wanted their ignorance. I wanted to go back to the time before I knew what betrayal felt like in stereo. But there's no going back. Once you see it, really see it, you can't unsee the ways people reshape themselves in your absence. You can't unfeel the cold. I opened my journal that night and wrote one sentence. They didn't steal my life. They freed me from a lie. It was the first time I didn't cry while writing. It was the first moment I felt like the pain might not last forever. There was still so much I didn't know, like how long it had really been going on, or who else knew, or whether they were still together now. But I no longer felt desperate for those answers. What I needed now wasn't information. What I needed was oxygen. space, separation, stillness. And the only way to get that was to stop asking why and start building what was left of me. I never meant to become a detective, but when your reality collapses under the weight of silence, you start digging, not for revenge, but for clarity. In the weeks that followed Christmas, I stopped trying to make peace with the pain. Instead, I started chasing the pattern. I wanted proof, not just for myself, but because some small part of me still hoped I'd find a reason that wasn't betrayal. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe the note was a sick joke. Maybe it didn't mean what I thought it meant. But hope, I've learned, is sometimes just a slower path to devastation. It started with social media. I remembered Darren had once tagged Brandon in an Instagram story months after the breakup. Something about brotherhood weekends and a blurry shot of 2 beers clinking by a lake. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time. Brandon and Darren had always gotten along. It made sense they'd stay in touch. But now, that post had new weight. I scrolled back, farther than I ever had before. Darren wasn't a heavy poster, but when he did share something, it always had meaning. Inside jokes, throwbacks, captions with just a little too much subtext. The first post that punched the air from my lungs was dated 6 weeks after Brandon left me. It was a photo of Darren's living room. Same old couch, same scratch on the coffee table. But now, a new object had entered the frame. The blue ceramic mug I'd bought for Brandon our first Christmas together. It was one of a kind, handmade, slightly chipped, with his initials painted at the bottom. It was in Darren's house. In the comments, someone had replied, "Love that mug." And Darren had answered, "You know it. Best gift I ever inherited." The word inherited sat on my tongue like acid. He hadn't just taken Brandon in, he had taken over. I kept going. There were text exchanges buried in my phone I hadn't deleted. Screenshots I'd sent Elise. Notes to myself during the wedding planning. One caught my attention, a pinned message chain from 2 months before the split. I'd written to Brandon, asking if he could meet me at the florist that afternoon. He said he couldn't. Darren needed him. That was the 3rd time that month. I opened my laptop and checked my old shared documents, the ones Brandon and I used to plan everything from the guest list to the menu. I clicked the last version he'd opened. It wasn't the final draft. It was the venue budget sheet. And the last time it had been opened was the night before he left me, while he was at Darren's apartment. I didn't want to speculate. I wanted facts, timelines, evidence that couldn't be distorted by memory. So I pulled up my credit card history. Brandon and I had used my account to book several vendors. He promised to reimburse me later, something I never thought to question. One charge in particular made my hands go cold, a boutique hotel 2 hours outside the city. The date matched the weekend Darren had told me he was visiting old college friends. I called the hotel. I said I needed a copy of the receipt for tax purposes. The woman on the line didn't hesitate. She emailed it right away. The reservation had been under Brandon's name. 2 guests, 2 meals charged to the room, champagne ordered at 9:23 p.m. I don't know why that detail gutted me the most. The timestamp. It made it real. Not just a suspicion, not just a betrayal of trust, but an actual moment, frozen in data, when the people I loved were celebrating while I was home, choosing centerpieces and writing vows. I put my head down on the kitchen table and stayed there for hours. The silence was no longer a void. It was deafening. I could hear it buzzing in my ears, pressing against my skull. They hadn't just taken something from me. They had made me the outsider in my own life. I remembered the week after Brandon left, how Darren came by with flowers and pizza, sat beside me while I cried, said he didn't understand why Brandon would do something so cruel. He had known, the entire time. He sat in my living room, wiped my tears with lies, and then walked out the door, probably to go meet the man who left me. I should have screamed. I should have smashed something. But instead, I sat still, paralyzed. Because when betrayal comes from the outside, you can fight it. You can defend yourself. But when it's woven into the people who know your middle name, your worst fears, your childhood secrets, there's nowhere left to run. Even your own mind feels contaminated. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I wrote. Not to anyone. Not for social media. Just for me. I wrote down the timeline. I mapped it all out. The dinner receipts, the hotel stay, the Instagram photos, the unexplained absences. I listed every clue I had ignored, every moment I had gaslit myself into believing that I was just being insecure or overly sensitive. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote, "It wasn't a coincidence. It was a campaign." I slept better that night than I had in weeks, not because the pain had lessened, it hadn't, but because now, at least, I wasn't questioning my own memory anymore. I had something solid beneath my feet. It didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel empty. But sometimes, clarity is the beginning of strength. You can't heal from a lie if you're still trying to believe it. There are betrayals that slice clean, like glass, sharp, fast, precise. And then there are the slow bleeds, the ones that drip over time until you're too dizzy to tell where the wound began. My mother's betrayal was the second kind. Growing up, I never felt unloved, but I did feel unchosen. Darren was always louder, needier, more dramatic. And in our household, that translated into attention. When he failed a class, the world stopped. When I got straight A's, I got a nod and a pat on the back. I didn't resent him for it. Not then. I just learned how to need less, to ask for less. I told myself it was maturity. But now, looking back, I see it was survival. After everything I'd uncovered about Brandon and Darren, after all the pieces fell into place, I still wasn't ready for what my mother would do when I came to her with the truth. I waited a week after the Christmas disaster before calling her. I needed time to process, to pull myself together. I told myself she would want to know, that maybe she'd offer comfort, not excuses. I went to her house on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. She greeted me with her usual practiced calm, offered me tea, and sat down like this was just another family check-in. I didn't bother with small talk. I placed the printouts on the table, the hotel receipts, the Instagram screenshots, the messages. I told her everything, clearly, calmly. I wanted to be heard. I wanted to be seen. But what I got was something else entirely. She stared at the papers for a long time, her lips pursed, her eyes unreadable. Then, without looking at me, she leaned back in her chair and said the words that broke me more than anything Brandon or Darren ever could. She said it was my fault. She said I'd been too intense in the relationship, that I clung too hard to people, that Darren probably stepped in because he saw how unstable things had gotten and wanted to help. Help. That was the word she used, as if what he did was an act of service. She asked why I was still holding on to all this instead of moving on. She said things fall apart sometimes, that men make mistakes, that maybe I should have seen the signs sooner if I'd been more self-aware. She never asked how I was feeling. She never once said, "I'm sorry." Instead, she polished her teacup with a napkin and reminded me that family is complicated, and that Darren had always been a little impulsive, but with a good heart. As if sleeping with your sister's fiancé was a character flaw, not a fracture. As if my grief was an overreaction. I sat there, numb, barely blinking. And in that moment, I realized something that I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. My mother never believed I was the one worth protecting. She didn't see me as a victim. She saw me as a problem. A woman who invited disappointment. A daughter who felt too much, talked too directly, asked for too many things to be fair. She had never seen me. Not really. When I was a child, she used to scold me for crying too easily. She'd tell me to toughen up, not to embarrass myself. Darren, though, when he cried, it was because he was sensitive and complicated. I had forgotten how many times I swallowed my feelings in her presence, how often I edited myself into something quieter, smaller, easier to love. I left her house without another word. I drove around for over an hour before I finally pulled over and sobbed into the steering wheel. Not because of what she said, but because I had expected anything different. That's what hurt the most. I had walked in thinking she might side with me. I had dared to believe that this time, the weight of proof would be enough to shift her allegiance. but I should have known. My mother never needed proof to defend Darren. He just needed to be hers. I, on the other hand, was the one she didn't quite know what to do with. I was too independent, too emotional, too much. In her world, women like me were difficult, and difficult women invited consequences. By the time I got home, I felt hollow, like my body was moving through molasses, like every organ had turned to stone. I didn't eat dinner. I didn't shower. I sat on the floor of my living room with the same receipts spread out around me, but they no longer looked like evidence. They looked like weapons, turned against me. It wasn't until later that night that I realized the pattern. It wasn't just Darren or Brandon. It was my mother. It was every time someone told me I was too much while rewarding men for being not enough. It was every time I got hurt and was told to be the bigger person. Every time I swallowed rage in exchange for false peace. I wasn't just grieving a relationship. I was grieving the version of family I had convinced myself I still belonged to. I wrote again that night. I wrote without trying to be poetic or wise. I wrote the ugliest truths I could find inside myself, about what it means to be the daughter who isn't protected, about the way women are trained to self-blame, about how deeply I wanted my mother to see me and how dangerous that longing had become. And then, at the very bottom of the page, I wrote, maybe it's not that they didn't love me. Maybe it's that they only knew how to love a version of me that didn't exist. It was the loneliest sentence I'd ever written, but it was also the most honest. For months after Brandon left, I blamed the confusion. I blamed timing. I blamed fear. I blamed everything except the one explanation that now stood so plainly in front of me. I had never been the main story. I had been a cover, a screen pulled down to hide what was really happening behind me. I was the distraction. I don't remember exactly when I stopped hoping they weren't together. It wasn't a single moment. It was a slow crumbling, 1,000 tiny realizations accumulating until the truth felt less like a surprise and more like a long overdue admission. But the moment I knew, really knew, came on a random Thursday, while I was cleaning out my closet. I found an old hard drive buried under scarves and notebooks, the one I used to back up photos before I got a cloud account. Out of morbid curiosity, or maybe hunger for final proof, I plugged it in. There were hundreds of files, birthdays, holidays, road trips, all those curated memories we once shared, preserved in JPEGs. I clicked into a folder labeled Wedding Prep. Inside were images I hadn't seen in over a year, venue visits, sample bouquets, dress fittings. But buried between 2 florist consultations was a photo I didn't remember taking. It was blurry, taken at night, in Darren's backyard. Brandon was sitting in one of the folding chairs, his hoodie pulled low over his eyes. Darren was beside him. They weren't smiling. They were looking at each other, too closely, too intently. I clicked again. Another photo. This time, the angle was different. It had been taken from behind a window. Brandon had his hand on Darren's knee. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for the denial to rise up and do its job. But it didn't. There was nothing ambiguous here. No room for excuses. That photo was dated 3 months before Brandon left. 3 months before I was writing vows, designing invitations, booking tables for guests I now knew would have been clapping for a performance. They hadn't waited until after the breakup. They hadn't stumbled into love in the ruins. They had started while I was still living in the middle of it. Every kindness Darren had shown me during that time, the check-ins, the way he defended Brandon when others started asking questions, had been strategic. A guilt management system, damage control in case I ever came too close to the truth. And Brandon? The man who once whispered forever into my ear while tracing circles on my back. He had been practicing a new version of forever with my brother while telling me I was the safest person he'd ever known. I didn't know what to do with that image. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat on the floor with the hard drive still humming, as if my computer hadn't just offered me visual proof that my life had been rewritten behind my back. I opened my journal again, but this time, the words came slowly. My hand shook as I wrote, because now, this wasn't just a betrayal of romance or family. This was a betrayal of identity. What was I to them? What had I ever been? A decoy? A placeholder? A shield? I started thinking about every time I'd been with both of them in a room. The way Brandon used to glance at Darren during game nights. How they always seemed to laugh at jokes I didn't quite catch. The long, unnecessary hugs. The inside jokes that made me feel like the third wheel in my own relationship. I used to think they were just close. Now I realized I had been orbiting something that was never mine to begin with. And the worst part? They didn't even have the decency to confess. They let me unravel on my own. Let me spend months believing I had done something wrong, that I had loved too deeply or expected too much. But it was never about what I lacked. It was about what they wanted, and didn't have the courage to claim until they had broken me to make space for it. I thought about confronting them, drafted a message I never sent. Not because I didn't want answers, but because I finally understood that no explanation would fix what had already rotted. No confrontation would undo what had been done in secret. They had already chosen themselves. Now, I had to choose me. I backed up the images, saved them to a private folder, not for revenge, not to expose anyone, just so I'd never again question my memory or allow someone else to rewrite the narrative. This happened. It wasn't a dream or a misunderstanding. It was real, and I had survived it. I put the hard drive back in its box, sealed it shut, and placed it on the highest shelf in my closet. Not to hide it, but to honor it. As proof of the story I lived through. As evidence of the woman I had become. That night, I wrote one last line. They found each other in my shadow. I found myself in their absence. It was the truest thing I'd ever written. I didn't plan to see him. I thought I'd go the rest of my life without another word exchanged, and honestly, that would have been easier, cleaner, but life rarely gives us clean exits. Sometimes it throws the past directly in our path when we least want it. It was mid-March when I saw Darren again. I had gone to visit our parents' house to drop off some paperwork my mom needed for the insurance on our childhood home. I'd called ahead. She wasn't supposed to be home, and certainly not Darren. But when I pulled into the driveway, his car was already there. For a moment, I sat frozen behind the wheel, heart thudding. I could have reversed, pretended I forgot. But I was tired of running from the ghosts of people still breathing. So I walked up the steps and rang the doorbell like I belonged there. He opened it. He didn't look surprised, not guilty, not ashamed, just tired. We stood there in silence. Him on the threshold, me in the cold spring air, fingers wrapped around the manila folder I almost forgot I was holding. I didn't ask to come in. He didn't invite me. The silence cracked first. "So I guess you figured it out," he said. Just like that. Not even a question, a statement. As if there had never been any doubt that I would eventually arrive at the truth. I didn't respond. He shifted, rubbing the back of his neck like he was the one under pressure. "We didn't mean for it to happen like that." That was his follow-up. Like that. As if what hurt me wasn't the betrayal itself, but the inconvenience of timing. As if all I needed was better formatting for the narrative. Still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't want to waste them. My silence was the only dignity I had left. He stepped aside and gestured toward the living room. I followed, though my body felt stiff, uninvited. We sat across from each other like strangers pretending to remember a shared childhood. He started talking. Rambling, really. Something about how he and Brandon found something real and didn't know what to do about it. How it was complicated. How love doesn't always arrive cleanly. I listened. Not because I cared, but because part of healing, I think, is bearing witness to the exact sound of someone breaking your heart with no apology in their throat. "He never meant to hurt you," Darren added at one point. And finally, I laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just the quiet laugh of someone who's lived through too much silence to let that sentence stand unchallenged. I looked him dead in the eye for the first time. And I said, "You watched me drown," and handed him the hose. He flinched, just barely. But it was there, a crack in his armor. It didn't bring me joy, it didn't feel like victory, but it felt like truth. He sat back, mouth opening and closing like he wanted to explain something, but there was nothing left to explain. No sentence could undo the reality that, for months, he chose to comfort my pain with lies while sharing a bed with the man who caused it. I told him I wasn't there for apologies, that I didn't want peace or closure or some rewritten version of events that made them both feel better about the damage they caused. I told him I knew about the hotel, about the mug, about the photo. His face fell, not in shock, but in resignation, like someone finally realizing the safety net was gone. Good. Let him fall. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but I didn't let it show. And before I left, I said one more thing, not for him, but for me. I never needed to be chosen. I just needed to stop choosing people who hide behind kindness while stealing what they never earned. Then I walked out. The air outside felt colder than it had when I arrived, but I breathed easier. That confrontation didn't bring relief. It didn't offer redemption, but it gave me something I hadn't had in months, the ability to stand in front of the person who broke me and feel absolutely nothing left to give them. I went home and lit a candle. Not for him, not for Brandon, for the version of me that used to need answers. She could rest now. The truth had come full circle, and I was still standing. When you stop staying quiet, people start calling you names. It didn't take long for the backlash to begin. Not from strangers, but from the people who'd once hugged me at holidays, toasted my engagement, and smiled at the photos I posted of Brandon and me on vacations we could barely afford. The same people who told me I was so lucky to have him. Now they said I was bitter. That word came like a whisper at first. Hushed mentions from mutual friends, awkward silences in group chats, subtle shifts in tone when I walked into a room. It grew louder the more I refused to pretend I was fine. They didn't want the truth. They wanted my silence. They wanted me to let it go. Move on. Be the graceful ex-bride. The understanding sister. The woman who forgives for the sake of family peace. But I had done that once. And it nearly cost me my sanity. This time, I wasn't apologizing for being hurt. I wasn't going to coat my grief in sugar just so they could keep their image of a functional, happy family. Still, the price of truth was steep. People I once called friends stopped responding to texts. One even blocked me after I shared a piece of the story on social media, a short post about betrayal, without names, without details, just a reflection, a wound, not a weapon. But it was enough. Enough to make people uncomfortable. Enough to make them defend Darren without ever asking me what had happened. Because in their minds, Darren was still the golden son, still charming, still just a little impulsive. And me? I was dramatic, too emotional, hard to love. Again. At first, I tried to explain. I tried to lay it all out, not for sympathy, but for understanding. I told a few people about the hotel, the note, the photo. I showed them the timeline, the receipts, the facts. They nodded politely, said things like, "That's really tough," and "I'm sorry you're hurting." But then came the inevitable follow-up. "Have you talked to Darren about how this is affecting you?" Maybe Brandon and Darren didn't handle it well, but don't they deserve happiness too? It's been a few months. Maybe try to let go? Let go of what, exactly? Of 5 years of trust? Of a family who chose silence over loyalty? Of a brother who watched me disintegrate and told himself it wasn't his problem? I realized something then. People don't want truth. They want comfort. And the easiest way to stay comfortable is to ignore the fire while blaming the one still burning. So I stopped explaining. I stopped justifying my pain. And for the first time in months, I turned inward. Not to self-destruct, but to rebuild. I started going to therapy twice a week. Not to get over Brandon, not even to process Darren, but to relearn what it meant to trust my own voice. I had spent so long bending myself into someone palatable, calm, forgiving, understanding, that I forgot what it meant to take up space with my own truth. I started writing more too, not just journaling, but essays, Reflections. I submitted one to a local magazine under a pseudonym. It was published within a month. The title was simple: When the Ones You Love Choose Silence. It resonated. Strangers reached out. People I'd never met messaged me to say, "This happened to me too." Women who had been called bitter, dramatic, jealous, crazy, all for daring to name their pain. Their words wrapped around me like warmth. I wasn't alone. I wasn't broken. I was just loud in a world that preferred women whisper their wounds. And with every story I read, every person who dared to speak the unspeakable, I felt my voice grow stronger. I started going to community writing circles, sat beside women who had walked through fire and survived. I didn't tell them my full story at first, but piece by piece, it came out. And every time I finished reading something I'd written, they didn't flinch. They nodded. They listened. They held space. Something my own mother had never done. Something my family never even offered. I realized I had been waiting for permission to move on. Waiting for someone to say, "Yes, what you feel is real." But I didn't need their permission. I needed my own. So I gave it. I stopped attending family dinners. I unfollowed Darren and Brandon online. I stopped checking who had watched my stories. I stopped hoping for some mass apology that would restore everything I had lost. Because what I lost wasn't just a relationship or a family bond. It was the illusion that love, alone, is enough to protect you from betrayal. It isn't. Love without honesty is performance. Love without loyalty is manipulation. Love without accountability is just decoration. And I was done decorating the lies of others with my silence. People still called me bitter, still whispered, still judged. Let them. Bitterness is what happens when the truth curdles inside you because you're not allowed to speak it. I had no intention of letting it rot in me. I was going to extract it, write it, name it, free it. And maybe one day, when someone else walks through a betrayal that leaves them gasping for air, they'll find something I wrote and realize they are not alone. Maybe that will be the legacy of this pain. Not shame, not silence, but solidarity. When I packed my car that April morning, I didn't cry. I didn't look back at the apartment that held both my dreams and my devastation. I didn't walk room to room, taking in the nostalgia like a movie montage. I didn't give the space the goodbye it probably deserved. I had already said my goodbyes, not to the apartment, to the version of myself who waited for closure. She was gone. In her place stood someone else, quieter but firmer. Someone who didn't need answers from people who had already told her everything by how little they cared. I left the city where I had built my almost life behind. Moved 3 hours south to a small town with wide skies, antique shops, and neighbors who didn't know my name. I found a rental above a florist. The woman who owned the shop, Marlene, let me move in early and only asked that I water the succulents in the hallway once a week. It was exactly the kind of freedom I needed. No history, no shared grocery store aisles with people who pitied me, no chance encounters with old friends who would say things like, "Wow, you look great," but whose eyes asked, "Is she still broken?" Here, I was no one, and I loved that. The days moved slowly at first. Mornings were the hardest. Waking up in a new bed, hearing unfamiliar birds, realizing that no one knew where I was unless I told them. But the weight of that solitude didn't scare me. It steadied me. I worked remotely. Freelance editing jobs, manuscript reviews, small pieces for digital magazines. I didn't need much to get by. I made coffee in the mornings and walked to the lake behind the bakery every afternoon. I started journaling again, but now it wasn't about grief. It was about space, breath, becoming. In June, I joined a local book club. Not because I wanted to talk, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be in a room where nobody knew what I'd lost. We read stories about people who reinvented themselves after disasters. I didn't speak the first 2 meetings, but by the third, I found myself nodding, laughing even. By the 5th, I shared a favorite quote. Nobody gasped or asked me about my past. They just smiled. That summer, I began to feel like I had skin again. Real skin, not just armor. I started running. Badly, at first. But every mile reminded me of what my body could do when it wasn't carrying the weight of betrayal. I didn't run away from the pain. I ran with it, beside it, until it no longer felt like something I needed to outrun. I dyed my hair in August. Nothing drastic, just a deeper brown, almost black. I didn't post about it, didn't tell anyone back home. But when I looked in the mirror, something shifted. I saw someone new, someone I wanted to get to know. The hardest part wasn't the memory of Brandon. It wasn't even Darren. It was the echo of my mother's voice in my head. That old script. You're too sensitive. You expect too much. You need to let things go. I had to unlearn her. Unlearn the way she made me feel like my anger was uglier than their betrayal. Unlearn the belief that silence was strength. In therapy, I started to name things I had never dared say out loud. That I had always been the one who had to keep the peace, even when I was the one bleeding. That I had become so good at appearing okay that nobody thought to check if I actually was. And beneath all of that, something tender began to emerge. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But grace. For myself. I forgave the woman who stayed too long in a relationship where she was already being erased. I forgave the sister who still hoped her brother would choose her. I forgave the daughter who kept asking for warmth from a mother made of cold stone. By the time autumn came, I felt roots. Not in people, but in myself. I started volunteering at the library, helping teens with writing workshops. I saw myself in some of them, especially the quiet girls, the ones who carried too much emotion for their age. I told them gently, "Your voice matters." And every time I said it, I meant it a little more for myself too. That October, my piece from the magazine was picked up by a national blog. It went viral. I read hundreds of comments from women around the world. Women who had been betrayed by siblings, partners, families. Women who had been called bitter for surviving. They weren't bitter. They were brave, just like I was learning to be. One night, I received an email from a woman named Leila. She said she had left her fiancé a month before the wedding after finding out he'd been seeing her cousin. She wrote, "I thought I was crazy until I read your words. You made me feel less alone." I cried reading that email. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that maybe, just maybe, my pain had built something useful, something that could shelter someone else from the storm. By December, I didn't think about them every day anymore. When I did, it was more like a scar than an open wound, something that stung occasionally, but mostly just reminded me how much I'd healed. I didn't go home for the holidays. Instead, I bought myself a small tree from the farmer's market, hung paper stars on it, and wrapped a single gift for myself. A new journal. On the first page, I wrote, "This year, I chose me." No apologies. No caveats. Just truth. I sat in my little living room that Christmas Eve, soft music playing, a candle flickering beside me, and I realized something I never thought I'd feel again. Peace. Not the kind that comes from reconciliation, the kind that comes from release. They could have each other. They could keep their version of the story, their tidy ending. I had something better. I had freedom. 1 year. That's how long it's been since the gift bag, since the note, the ring, the unraveling. I used to count time in before and after. Before the betrayal, after the silence, before I knew what they were, after I learned who I was to them. But now, time feels different. Not broken, not marked by trauma, just mine. My mornings are quiet now, but not the hollow kind of quiet that follows abandonment. This quiet is intentional, peaceful. My phone doesn't buzz with messages from people demanding explanations I no longer owe. My days begin with stillness, coffee, words, breath, and sometimes laughter. It comes easier now, unexpected, undemanding. Like the day I found an old voicemail from Brandon I'd forgotten to delete. I listened to it once, not for pain, not for nostalgia, just to see if the sound of his voice still curled around my ribs like it used to. It didn't. It was just a voice. I deleted it with a steady hand. That felt like a win. The last few months taught me that healing isn't linear. Some days I still feel the sting. Especially when I see siblings laughing in cafes, when I read love stories that don't end in fire. But the ache no longer owns me. It visits, and it leaves. There's a strength in that. I still write, more than ever. One of my essays was picked up by a podcast that asked if I'd record a reading. I did. My voice shook the first time I said the words aloud. He left me 2 weeks before our wedding. My brother handed me the ring. But by the final sentence, I sounded like someone who survived it. Because I did. I've made friends here, real ones. People who know me as Julia, not the girl who was left, not the sister who got replaced. Just me. I've hosted dinner parties in my tiny apartment, laughed until my face hurt, cried without shame when I needed to, and learned how to say no without guilt. Sometimes I still think about reaching out to my mother. There's a drawer with letters I started and never sent. Some are angry. Some are soft. Some just ask, why? But I always stop, because she made her choice. And now, so have I. Last week, I passed a woman on the street wearing a dress identical to the one I had chosen for my would-be wedding. My breath caught, not from grief, but recognition. It was beautiful. But it wasn't mine anymore. I smiled. In early spring, I returned to my old city for the first time. Not to visit family, but to speak at a workshop for survivors of emotional betrayal. I stood in a room full of women whose stories mirrored mine in ways both painful and empowering. One woman asked me, "What was the moment you knew you'd survived it?" I thought for a second. Then I said, "When I stopped waiting for them to fix what they broke." 16 heads nodded. That evening, I walked past the cafe where Brandon and I had our first date. It looked smaller than I remembered. I stood across the street, watching strangers walk in and out, none of them knowing what that place once meant to me. That's the thing about healing. The world doesn't erase what happened, but it stops making it the center of everything. You carry the story differently. I carry mine like a scar, not a wound, a reminder, not a weight. I no longer need them to understand. I no longer need to rewrite the ending, because this is the ending, and I wrote it myself. A few weeks ago, I received an email from Darren. The subject line was one word: peace. The message was short, a vague acknowledgement of pain, a soft attempt at reconciliation. It didn't say, "I'm sorry." It didn't say, "I was wrong." Just, "I hope you're okay. I still think about everything. I hope we can talk someday." I stared at it for a long time. Then I typed back, "I am okay. But I no longer want to talk about everything. I've made peace without your version." And I hit send. That was my closure. No dramatics, no final confrontation. Just truth. Simple. Firm. I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. That night, I took a walk by the lake. The stars were out, scattered like tiny validations. I whispered aloud, not to anyone, but just because it felt right. "I forgive you, but I don't need you back." And then to myself, "You made it." 6 words. This time, they were mine, and they carried no venom, no sadness, only freedom. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been replaced, dismissed, or betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know something. You are not too much. You are not bitter. You are not broken. You are honest. And your story deserves to be heard. Like this video, subscribe to support this channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. You are not alone. Your voice matters. And I'm so glad you're here.